the shadowed alleys of 1920s Paris, a young poet is found stabbed, a cryptic symbol marking his fate. Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming spinster with a razor-sharp mind, steps from her quiet English village into a web of secrets. A rare manuscript, hiding wartime betrayals, binds a charming art dealer, a nervous artist, and a haunted soldier. As clues unravel in a quaint bookshop, danger lurks. Will Miss Marple expose the killer before the past claims another life? Dive into a mystery where every shadow hides a truth. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Paris. The rain fell in a gentle, persistent drizzle over Danefield, a village so unassuming it might have been overlooked by time itself. In her neat cottage on Willow Lane, Miss Jane Marple sat by a crackling fire, her knitting needles moving with the quiet precision of a metronome. The room was a study in modest comfort. Lace curtains, a well-worn armchair, and a shelf of books that hinted at her curiosity about the world beyond the village. Outside, the world was grey and damp, but within, the glow of the fire cast a warm circle of light. It was a day, Miss Marple thought, for reflection, though her sharp mind was never truly at rest. The postman's knock broke her reverie. He delivered a single letter, its envelope bearing a French stamp and an elegant, looping script. It was from Madame Elise Dubois, a friend from Miss Marple's schoolgirl days, now a widow living in Paris. The letter was an invitation, warm and insistent, urging Miss Marple to visit her bookshop near the Seine. "Paris is a city of stories, Jane," Elise wrote, "and I find myself longing for your quiet wisdom amidst its clamour." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. She had not seen Elise in years, but the prospect of Paris, with its blend of charm and mystery, stirred something in her. Besides, Danefield had been rather too quiet of late, and her knack for noticing the undercurrents of human behaviour craved a new challenge. She packed a modest suitcase, choosing her sensible tweeds and a single good hat, and within days she was on a train bound for Dover, then across the Channel to Paris. The journey was uneventful, save for her observations of fellow passengers. A young couple whispering anxiously, a businessman with a too careful glance at his briefcase. Miss Marple filed these details away, as she always did, for one never knew when a small observation might prove significant. Paris greeted her with a burst of autumnal splendour. The boulevards were alive with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages and the newfangled hum of motor cars, their drivers navigating with Gallic impatience. Elise's bookshop, Librairie des Rêves, stood on a narrow street near the Pont Neuf, its facade painted a faded green, with windows displaying volumes of poetry and history. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather, shelves groaning under the weight of books in French, English, and even Latin. Elise, her hair now silver, but her eyes as lively as in their youth, embraced Miss Marple warmly. Over a pot of Earl Grey, served in delicate porcelain cups, they reminisced about schoolgirl pranks and shared news of their lives. Yet Miss Marple, ever attuned to subtleties, sensed a shadow behind Elise's hospitality. As they spoke, Elise's fingers fidgeted with her necklace, and her gaze darted to the shop's door each time the bell jingled. "Is something troubling you, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as gentle as a breeze. Elise hesitated, then confessed to a vague unease. Strange visitors had come to the shop in recent weeks, men who lingered too long, asking for books they never bought, their voices low and guarded. she had overheard snatches of conversation about a rare manuscript, Les Ombres de Paris, which her late husband, Henri, had once hidden in the shop. "It's nothing, perhaps," Elise said, but her smile was strained. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning over possibilities, much as she might unravel a tangled skein of wool. That evening they dined at a small bistro, then strolled along the Seine, the river reflecting the city's lights like scattered jewels. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor. They had just passed a cluster of artists sketching the cathedral silhouette when a sharp scream shattered the night. Miss Marple's hand tightened on her umbrella, her senses alert. Elise gasped, clutching her arm, as they hurried toward the sound, which came from a narrow alley branching off the quay. There, in the dim glow of a gas lamp, lay a young man, sprawled on the cobblestones. Blood seeped from a wound in his chest, where a knife still protruded, its handle gleaming darkly. His eyes were open, fixed in a stare of surprise. A small crowd gathered, murmuring in French, as two gendarmes pushed through, their boots echoing in the confined space. Elise whispered, "That's Pierre Lefebvre, one of my customers, a poet, always scribbling in his notebook." Miss Marple knelt briefly, her eyes scanning the scene. The young man's wallet lay untouched in his pocket, his watch still ticking on his wrist. The knife, she noted, had been thrust with precision, not the wild stab of a panicked thief. The gendarmes, brisk and dismissive, declared it a robbery gone wrong, shooing the onlookers away. But Miss Marple lingered, her gaze catching a detail the officers missed. A faint smudge of chalk on the alley wall, forming an odd symbol, like a half-drawn star. She said nothing, but her mind, honed by years of unravelling village intrigues, began to weave a pattern. As she and Elise returned to the bookshop, the lights of Paris seemed to dim, the city's charm now laced with a quiet menace. Miss Marple knew, with the certainty of experience, that this was no simple crime. There was a story here, hidden in the shadows, and she intended to read it to its end. Chapter 2. Bookshop Secrets. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Librairie de Rêve, casting a golden glow over the cluttered shelves and worn oak floor. Miss Jane Marple sat in a corner of the bookshop, her knitting needles clicking softly, a picture of serene domesticity amidst the chaos of Paris. Yet her eyes, sharp and bright as a sparrow's, missed nothing. The previous night's discovery of Pierre Lefebvre's body had stirred her instinct, and she felt the familiar prickle of a puzzle that demanded solving. Elise Dubois, her friend and the shop's proprietor, bustled about, arranging books with a distracted air, her usual cheer dimmed by the tragedy. Miss Marple sipped her tea, served in a chipped but elegant cup, and considered the facts. Pierre, a poet with a penchant for rare books, had been stabbed with surgical precision, his belongings untouched. The chalk symbol on the alley wall, unnoticed by the gendarmes, suggested a deeper motive than a mere robbery. She recalled a case in Danefield where a cryptic note in a church pew had unravelled a smuggling scheme, and she wondered if Pierre's death was tied to something equally clandestine. Elise had mentioned a rare manuscript, Les Ombres de Paris, and Miss Marple's thoughts kept circling back to it. In her experience, objects of value, whether monetary or sentimental, often lay at the heart of such matters. "Elise, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but probing, "tell me more about this manuscript Pierre was so curious about." Elise paused, a volume of Baudelaire in her hands, and sighed. She explained that Les Ombres de Paris was a legend among Parisian bibliophiles, a slim volume from the war years, rumoured to contain coded messages about resistance activities. Her late husband, Henri, had acquired it under mysterious circumstances and hidden it in the shop, but after his death it had vanished. Pierre was obsessed with it, Elise admitted. He came in almost daily, asking if I'd found it, though I told him it was long gone. Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the young man's persistence. Obsession, she knew, could be a dangerous thing. The shop's bell jingled, announcing the arrival of Monsieur Claude Renaud, an art dealer whose tailored suit and polished cane bespoke wealth and confidence. His smile was charming, but Miss Marple detected a hardness in his eyes, like those of a Danefield squire who'd once cheated his tenants. Claude greeted Elise with a flourish, inquiring about a first-edition Rimbaud, though his gaze flickered to the back of the shop where rare books were kept. Miss Marple, pretending to adjust her knitting, observed his restless fingers and the way he scanned the room, as if searching for something or someone. Next came Mademoiselle Annette Bisset, a young artist with a pale face and nervous hands. Her scarf was askew, and her eyes darted to Claude before settling on the floor. She mumbled about needing sketchbooks, but Miss Marple noted her hesitation near a shelf of old journals, as if drawn to something specific. Finally, Monsieur Julien Moreau entered, a retired soldier with a pronounced limp and a face weathered by more than years. He nodded curtly to Elise and lingered near the rare books, his fingers tracing the spines with a familiarity that belied his casual air. Miss Marple's needles paused. 3 visitors, each with a connection to Pierre, each with a secret air. She thought of a Danefield tea party where whispered gossip had exposed a theft, and resolved to learn more about this trio. Over lunch, Elise shared what she knew. Claude, a regular, had a reputation for ruthless business dealings, and had argued with Pierre about an unpaid debt just days before the murder. Annette, a struggling artist, often sketched in the shop and seemed infatuated with Pierre, though her shy demeanour made it hard to tell. Julien, a quiet figure, had known Pierre during the war, and visited the shop to read military histories, though he rarely spoke. Miss Marple listened, her mind weaving their stories into a pattern. She recalled how in Danefield, a quiet gardener had turned out to be a blackmailer, and wondered which of these 3 hid a darker truth. That afternoon, the shop was quiet until a commotion erupted in the back room. Elise rushed in, Miss Marple following at a measured pace. There, on the floor, lay Annette, unconscious, her sketchbook spilled open beside her. A small vial of laudanum rested near her hand, its stopper loose. Elise gasped, calling for help, and a neighbour fetched a doctor. The gendarmes arrived, their heavy boots echoing, and declared it an attempted suicide, citing Annette's fragile demeanour. But Miss Marple, kneeling beside the girl, noted the vial was nearly full, its contents barely spilled. Annette's pulse was steady, her breathing even, and a faint scent of lavender clung to her scarf, not the bitter tang of laudanum. Miss Marple's lips pursed. This was no suicide attempt, but a performance, staged to distract or deceive. She examined the sketchbook, its pages filled with studies of Parisian scenes, cafes, bridges, and curiously, a detailed drawing of the alley where Pierre had died. The sketch included the same chalk symbol Miss Marple had seen, rendered with uncanny precision. She tucked this observation away, her mind turning to the manuscript again. Could Annette know its whereabouts? Or was she protecting someone else? Miss Marple recalled a Danefield girl who'd feigned illness to cover a lover's theft, and wondered if Annette's collapse was a similar ruse. As the doctor tended to Annette, Miss Marple spoke softly to Elise. "Tell me, has anyone else asked about the manuscript recently?" Elise hesitated, then admitted that Claude had inquired about it weeks ago, claiming an interest in rare books for a client. Julien, too, had once asked if Henri had left any papers behind, his tone casual but his eyes intent. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her thoughts racing. The manuscript, she suspected, was no mere collector's item, but a key to something far more dangerous, perhaps a secret Pierre had died to protect. By evening, Annette was revived and sent home, pale but unharmed. The gendarmes left, satisfied with their suicide theory, but Miss Marple lingered in the back room, her eyes scanning the shelves. She noticed a faint scuff on the floor near a heavy bookcase, as if it had been moved recently. With Elise's help, she shifted the case, revealing a dusty ledger hidden in a recess. Its pages listed book sales from years past, but one entry caught her eye. A purchase of Les Ombres de Paris, marked with a symbol matching the one in Annette's sketch. Miss Marple closed the ledger, her expression serene but her mind alight. The bookshop, it seemed, held more than stories. It held secrets, and she was determined to uncover them before another tragedy struck. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Marais. The morning air in Paris carried a crisp edge, and Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in her sensible shawl, stepped out of Librairie des Rêves with a determined glint in her eye. The events of the previous day, Annette's staged collapse and the discovery of the ledger, had sharpened her focus. Pierre Lefebvre's murder, she was certain, was no random act, and the cryptic symbol in Annette's sketchbook suggested a trail leading beyond the bookshop's walls. To understand Pierre, she needed to walk his world, and so she set out for the Marais, the bohemian quarter where the young poet had lived. The Marais was a labyrinth of cobbled streets and ancient buildings, their facades weathered but proud. Artists sketched in doorways, vendors hawked flowers, and the air buzzed with the chatter of poets and dreamers. Yet Miss Marple, with her unassuming air, noted a darker undercurrent. Furtive glances, whispered exchanges in shadowed corners. She recalled a Danefield fair where pickpockets had mingled with the crowd, and sensed a similar tension here, as if the quarter guarded its secrets closely. Pierre's lodging was a narrow building on Rue des Rosiers, its paint peeling like old skin. The landlady, Madame Colette, a stout woman with sharp eyes, greeted Miss Marple with suspicion until she mentioned Elise. Pierre was a good tenant, Madame Colette said, leading her up creaking stairs to his attic room, but troubled, always scribbling, always dreaming. The room was sparse, a sagging bed, a desk cluttered with papers, and a window overlooking the rooftops. Miss Marple's gaze swept the space, noting a stack of poetry books, a cracked mirror, and a small easel with a half-finished sketch of a Parisian alley, eerily similar to the one where Pierre had died. Madame Colette lingered, her hands smoothing her apron. "He had visitors," she offered unprompted. "That art dealer, Monsieur Renaud, came often, arguing about money. And the soldier, Monsieur Moreau, with his limp, he'd sit with Pierre, talking of the war. Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away these connections. She recalled a Danefield widower whose visitors had betrayed his trust, and wondered what Claude and Julien sought from Pierre. "Did he ever mention a manuscript?" she asked, her tone mild. Madame Colette frowned. "He spoke of a book once, said it held truths the city hides. I thought it just his poet's nonsense." Among Pierre's papers, Miss Marple found a bundle of sketches, each depicting Parisian alleys with meticulous detail. Several bore the same cryptic symbol, a half-drawn star marked in chalk or ink. One sketch stood out, a map of sorts, its lines tracing a path from the Marais to a café in Montmartre, the Café des Ombres. Miss Marple tucked the sketch into her handbag, her fingers brushing the soft wool of her knitting. A map, she knew, could lead to more than a place. It could lead to a motive. Bidding Madame Colette farewell, Miss Marple made her way to Montmartre, her umbrella tapping the cobblestones. The Café des Ombres was a dimly lit haunt, its tables crowded with artists and intellectuals, their voices mingling with the clink of wineglasses. She settled in a corner, her unassuming presence drawing no attention, and ordered a pot of tea. Her eyes, however, were everywhere. Julien Moreau sat at a table near the window, his weathered face tense as he spoke to a stranger in a dark coat. The stranger's back was to her, but his gestures were sharp, urgent. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a rhythm to mask her scrutiny. When Julien glanced her way, she bent over her knitting, the picture of an elderly tourist. The conversation ended abruptly, and the stranger slipped out, his coat collar turned up. Miss Marple, with the agility of purpose, if not of youth, followed at a discreet distance. The man wove through Montmartre's winding streets, finally entering a dilapidated building on a quiet lane. She noted the address, Rue des Ombres, number 17, and the faded sign above the door, suggesting it had once been a printer's shop. She did not linger, aware that an old lady loitering in such a place might draw unwanted eyes, but her mind was alight with possibilities. Was this a meeting place, a hideout, or something more sinister? Returning to the bookshop, Miss Marple found Elise sorting through a delivery of novels, her face still pale from the previous day's events. Over tea, Miss Marple shared her findings, omitting only the address for now. "Pierre was searching for something," she said, "and I believe it was that manuscript. It may hold secrets someone is desperate to keep hidden." Elise's hands trembled as she poured another cup. "Henri once said the manuscript named men who betrayed the resistance," she confided. "He hid it to protect our family, but I never knew why." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her thoughts were razor-sharp. Betrayal, she knew from a Danefield scandal involving a forged will, could drive men to desperate acts. As dusk fell, the bookshop grew quiet, its shadows lengthening. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting a pretext for watching the street. A figure paused outside, peering through the glass before hurrying away. She couldn't see the face, but the limp was unmistakable. Julien Moreau. Her mind turned to the stranger in the dark coat, the sketches, and the manuscript's rumoured secrets. Pierre, she suspected, had stumbled onto a truth that cost him his life. The Marais, with its charm and shadows, had given her a thread to follow, and she would tug it gently, as she always did, until the whole tapestry unravelled. Chapter 4. The Art Dealer's Gambit. The Parisian evening was ablaze with lights. As Miss Jane Marple stepped from a taxi onto the cobbled street outside Monsieur Claude Renaud's art gallery in the heart of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. The invitation to his exhibition had arrived that morning at Librairie des Rêves, a gilded card promising an evening of fine art and finer company. Elise, eager for a distraction from the bookshop's recent turmoil, had persuaded Miss Marple to attend, though the latter needed little convincing. Her instincts, honed by years of untangling village intrigues, told her that Claude's glittering world might reveal more about Pierre Lefebvre's murder than the shadowed alleys of the Marais. The gallery was a temple of elegance, its white walls adorned with vivid canvases, and its air heavy with the scent of champagne and perfume. Paris's elite mingled in clusters, their laughter sharp and their jewels catching the light. Miss Marple, in her unassuming tweed and a single pearl brooch, blended into the crowd as effortlessly as a sparrow among peacocks. Her eyes, however, were anything but ordinary, darting from face to face, noting the subtle tells of human nature. She recalled a Denfield fête where a stolen necklace had been betrayed by a nervous glance, and she knew such gatherings often laid bare hidden truths. Claude Renaud moved through the room with the grace of a panther, his tailored suit impeccable, his smile a calculated charm. He greeted Elise warmly, bowing over her hand, but when Miss Marple extended hers, his grip was fleeting, his eyes sliding past her as if she were merely an appendage to the evening. She smiled faintly, accustomed to being underestimated, and turned her attention to the paintings. One caught her eye, a dark, brooding depiction of a Parisian alley, its shadows deep and menacing, with a figure clutching a knife that gleamed like a crescent moon. The scene was too close to Pierre's murder for coincidence, and Miss Marple noted the artist's signature, Annette Bisset. Annette herself was present, standing near a cluster of admirers, her pale face flushed from wine or nerves. She wore a simple dress, but her hands twisted a handkerchief and her eyes avoided Claude's. Miss Marple, sipping a glass of lemonade, observed the girl's unease, recalling how Annette's staged collapse in the bookshop had suggested a deeper involvement. Julien Moreau was also there, looking out of place in his plain coat among the glittering crowd. He stood by a window, his limp more pronounced as he shifted his weight, his gaze fixed on Claude with an intensity that bordered on hostility. Miss Marple's knitting, tucked into her handbag for the evening, would have clicked in rhythm with her thoughts had she held it. She approached the alley painting, pretending to study its brushstrokes while listening to the chatter around her. A woman in furs remarked on its haunting quality, but Miss Marple's mind was on the chalk symbol she'd seen in Pierre's sketches and Annette's book, a symbol absent from this canvas but present in her memory. She recalled a Danefield artist who'd hidden a coded message in a landscape, and wondered if Annette's work held similar secrets. Moving closer to Claude, she engaged him in small talk, her voice soft and disarming. "Such a striking piece," she said, gesturing to the painting. "Did you know the young man who died in an alley so like this one?" Claude's smile tightened, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "Pierre? A tragic loss, but I barely knew him. A poet, always in debt." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the way his hand gripped his glass, the knuckles whitening. She thanked him and drifted away, her mind turning over his words. Debt, she knew, could be a motive for murder, but so could fear of exposure. She thought of the manuscript, Les Ombres de Paris, and its rumoured wartime secrets, wondering if Claude's polished exterior hid a connection to those dark days. Later, in a quiet corner, Miss Marple overheard a hushed exchange between Claude and Julian. "Keep quiet about the book," Claude hissed, his voice low but sharp. "It's buried, and it stays that way." Julian's reply was inaudible, but his posture, stiff, defiant, spoke volumes. Miss Marple, pretending to admire a sculpture, filed this away. The book, she was certain, was the thread binding these events, much like a Danefield ledger that had revealed a vicar's embezzlement. She resolved to watch Claude closely, sensing his charm masked a dangerous edge. The evening was winding down, when Elise, flushed with excitement, drew Miss Marple aside. "Jane, you'll never guess. Claude offered to buy the bookshop." Her voice was a mix of astonishment and temptation. "He says it's for an investment, to expand his gallery. But I don't know." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The offer, coming so soon after Pierre's death and Annette's incident, felt too convenient. She patted Elise's hand, her tone soothing. "Be cautious, my dear. Sudden generosity often hides an ulterior motive." That night, back at the bookshop, Miss Marple was awakened by a crash. Elise, in her nightgown, stood trembling as they discovered the front door ajar, papers strewn across the floor. Nothing appeared stolen, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a torn page caught under a shelf, bearing the half-star symbol from Pierre's sketches. She slipped it into her pocket, her mind racing. The break-in, she suspected, was no random act but a desperate search for the manuscript. Claude's wealth, Annette's sketches, Julien's wartime past, each was a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple felt the pattern taking shape, as it had in Danefield when a stolen brooch had led to a blackmailer's downfall. She would bide her time, her quiet demeanour a shield, until the truth emerged from the shadows. Chapter 5. The Soldier's Past. The Parisian morning was cloaked in a soft mist, the Seine shimmering faintly as Miss Jane Marple sat at a small patisserie near Librairie des Rêves. She had invited Monsieur Julien Moreau for tea, choosing a neutral setting to coax the reticent soldier into conversation. The patisserie, with its checkered tablecloths and aroma of fresh croissants, was a far cry from the shadowed alleys of the Marais. Yet Miss Marple knew that secrets could surface anywhere, given the right nudge. Her knitting rested in her lap, a prop to ease Julien's guard, much as she had once disarmed a Danefield poacher with a cup of tea and a listening ear. Julien arrived promptly, his limp pronounced as he navigated the crowded tables. His face, etched with lines of hardship, softened slightly at Miss Marple's welcoming smile. She ordered tea and made small talk about Paris's charm, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "You must know the city well, Monsieur Moreau," she said, her eyes bright with interest. "A soldier's life takes one to many places." Julien nodded, his gaze distant, and spoke of his service during the war, his voice low and measured. He had fought in the resistance, he said, enduring wounds that left him with his limp and a pension that barely sustained him. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking gently, noting the way Julien's hands clenched when he mentioned the war's end. She recalled a Danefield veteran whose silences had hidden a guilty conscience, and steered the conversation toward Pierre Lefebvre. "You knew him then, during those difficult years?" she asked, her tone as casual as if discussing the weather. Julien's eyes flickered, a shadow crossing his face. Yes, he admitted, Pierre was young, idealistic. He carried messages for us, risked his life. We were comrades, of a sort. Sensing a crack in his reserve, Miss Marple mentioned the manuscript Les Ombres de Paris, watching his reaction closely. Pierre was curious about a certain book, I hear, she said, her voice mild. One that might hold memories of those times. Julian's teacup paused halfway to his lips, and for a moment she thought he might bolt. Then he sighed, his shoulders sagging. That cursed book, he muttered. Pierre thought it held names, collaborators who betrayed our cause. He believed exposing them would bring justice. His tone was bitter, and Miss Marple noted a tremor in his hand. Was it guilt, fear, or something else? She pressed gently, asking if he knew where the manuscript might be. Julian shook his head, his eyes avoiding hers. Lost, I hope. Some truths are better buried. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over his words. Julian's reticence suggested a personal stake, much like a Danefield shopkeeper who'd hidden a family scandal. She thanked him warmly, letting him think her questions mere curiosity, but her thoughts were already racing. Julian's wartime connection to Pierre, his presence at the Café des Ombres, and his unease about the manuscript pointed to a secret he guarded fiercely. She resolved to keep him in her sights, for secrets, in her experience, often led to motives. Back at the bookshop, Elise was dusting shelves, her movements restless. Miss Marple shared snippets of her conversation with Julian, careful not to alarm her friend. He's a man carrying a burden, she said, but whether it's guilt or grief, I'm not yet sure. Elise, her brow furrowed, revealed a new discovery. While cleaning Henri's old desk, she'd found a hidden drawer containing a letter. She handed it to Miss Marple, who unfolded the brittle paper with care. Written in Henri's spidery hand, it warned of the manuscript's danger, describing it as a ledger of betrayal that could ruin lives if exposed. I hid it for our safety, Henri wrote, but I fear it will find the light. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. The letter confirmed her suspicions. The manuscript was no mere relic, but a Pandora's box of wartime secrets. She thought of Claude Renault's sharp warning to Julian at the gallery, and Annette Bisset's nervous sketches, each a thread in the tapestry of Pierre's murder. Annette, in particular, troubled her. The girl's collapse, staged with laudanum, suggested she knew more than she admitted. Miss Marple recalled a Danefield girl who'd feigned distress to protect a lover, and wondered if Annette's loyalty lay with Claude, or perhaps with a secret of her own. As evening fell, the bookshop grew quiet, its shelves casting long shadows. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting a steady rhythm, when she noticed Annette lingering outside, her face pale in the lamplight. The girl hesitated, then entered, her hands twisting a scarf. Madame Dubois, she stammered, I wanted to apologize for yesterday. Her eyes darted to Miss Marple, who smiled benignly, as if unaware of the girl's agitation. Elise, ever kind, reassured her. But Miss Marple noted Annette's glance toward the rare books section, where the ledger had been found. Was she searching for something, or ensuring it remained hidden? After Annette left, Miss Marple examined the hidden drawer again, finding only dust and a faint scratch, as if something else had been removed. She suspected the manuscript, or part of it, had been there until recently, perhaps taken during the break-in. her thoughts returned to Julien's guarded words, Claude's whispered threats, and Annette's nervous demeanour. Each was a piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple felt the pattern tightening, much as it had in Danefield, when a stolen locket had led to a murderer's confession. She would need to tread carefully, for the truth, like the manuscript, was buried deep, and someone was willing to kill to keep it that way. Chapter 6. The Alley's Truth. The Parisian dawn painted the sky in hues of rose and gold, but Miss Jane Marple was already awake, her mind as alert as the sparrows chirping outside Librairie des Rêves. The events of the past days, Pierre's murder, Annette's staged collapse, Julien's guarded admissions, and Claude's veiled threats, had woven a complex web. And she sensed the truth lay close, hidden in the details she had so carefully gathered. The chalk symbol, the manuscript's rumoured secrets, and the break-in at the bookshop all pointed to a motive rooted in the past. Determined to retrace Pierre's final steps, she resolved to return to the alley where he had died, certain that the scene held clues the gendarmes had overlooked. Bundled in her sensible coat, Miss Marple set out, her umbrella a steady companion on the damp cobblestones. The alley, tucked off the quay near the Seine, was quieter by day. Its shadows softened, but no less ominous. She stood where Pierre's body had lain, her eyes scanning the surroundings with the precision of a cartographer. The gas lamp flickered weakly, its light revealing little now, but she recalled the scene vividly. The knife, the untouched wallet, the chalk symbol, a half-star, like a beacon to those who knew its meaning. She paced the alley, her steps measured, her mind sifting through possibilities as she had once done in Danefield, unravelling a case of poisoned jam. Near the wall where the symbol had been, Miss Marple noticed a glint in a crack between the cobblestones. Kneeling with care, she retrieved a small button, its surface engraved with a crest, a stylized eagle, identical to one she'd seen on Claude Renault's cufflinks at the gallery. She slipped it into her pocket, her expression serene but her thoughts racing. A button, she knew, could be as damning as a fingerprint, much like a lost glove that had betrayed a Danefield thief. She continued her inspection, her eyes catching a faint chalk mark near a sewer grate, another half-star, almost erased by rain. It pointed downward, as if guiding her to something hidden. With a glance to ensure no one watched, Miss Marple enlisted a passing street sweeper, a wiry youth who, for a few francs, agreed to lift the grate. Beneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small package. She thanked the boy and retreated to a nearby bench, unwrapping it with care. Inside were several pages of Les Ombres de Paris, their edges brittle, the text a mix of French and coded symbols. The pages listed names, dates and locations, details of wartime betrayals she suspected, though the code eluded her. She recalled a Danefield cipher that had hidden a smuggler's roots, and knew decoding this would require time. For now, the discovery confirmed her theory. Pierre had found part of the manuscript, and someone had killed him to keep it buried. Returning to the bookshop, Miss Marple shared her find with Elise, whose hands trembled as she touched the pages. "Henri warned me about this," Elise whispered. "He said it could destroy families, even now." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to Claude, whose cufflink button placed him in the alley, and Julien, whose wartime past tied him to the manuscript's secrets. Annette, too, remained a puzzle. Her sketches and staged collapse suggested knowledge, perhaps complicity. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Annette, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. "I need to speak to you," she said, glancing nervously at the street. Over tea, Annette's words tumbled out. She admitted knowing Pierre had found part of the manuscript hidden in the bookshop's back room. "He showed me a page," she said, "but I begged him to stop looking. It was dangerous." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple, with her gentle probing, sensed fear rather than guilt. "Did you tell anyone else?" she asked, her tone as soft as a lullaby. Annette shook her head, but her eyes flickered, betraying a lie. Miss Marple recalled a Danefield girl who'd lied to protect a brother, and wondered if Annette shielded someone, perhaps Claude, whose charm had swayed her. Determined to test her theory, Miss Marple proposed a gathering at the bookshop that evening, inviting Claude, Julien, and Annette. "We must discuss Pierre's death," she told Elise, "and the manuscript. The truth will come out when they're together." Elise, though anxious, agreed, trusting her friend's quiet authority. Miss Marple spent the afternoon studying the manuscript pages, noting a recurring name, Renaud, linked to coded entries. Could it be Claude's father, a collaborator whose shame Claude sought to conceal? She thought of a Danefield squire whose son had killed to hide a scandal, and felt the pieces aligning. As dusk settled, the bookshop's lamps cast a warm glow, but the air was thick with tension. Miss Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting a steady rhythm, her eyes watching the door. The alley's truth was in her hands now, and she would use it to unravel the lies that bound Pierre's killer to the shadows of Paris. Chapter 7. The Final Revelation. The lamps of Librairie des Rêves cast a soft golden glow over the bookshop's back room, where Miss Jane Marple had arranged her gathering. The air was heavy with the scent of old books and the unspoken weight of secrets. A small table held a teapot and cups, their delicate clink a counterpoint to the tension that hung like a fog. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, her knitting idle in her lap, her eyes bright and unyielding as she surveyed her guests. Claude Renaud, impeccable in his tailored suit, Julien Moreau, his weathered face taut, and Annette Bisset, her hands twisting a handkerchief, her gaze darting nervously. Elise Dubois stood by the door, her expression a mix of trust in her friend and dread of what was to come. Miss Marple began, her voice as gentle as a village vicar's sermon, yet laced with steel. "We are here to discuss poor Pierre Lefebvre's death," she said, "and the manuscript Les Ombres de Paris, which seems to lie at the heart of it." She produced the oilcloth package from her handbag, unfolding it to reveal the brittle pages she had found in the alley. Claude's eyes narrowed, Julian's hands clenched, and Annette let out a small gasp. Miss Marple continued, her tone measured. "Pierre was killed not for money, but for what he knew. This manuscript names those who betrayed the resistance during the war, names that could ruin reputations even now." She recounted the facts with quiet precision. Pierre's obsession with the manuscript, the chalk symbols in his sketches, the staged laudanum incident with Annette, and the break-in at the bookshop. "Someone," she said, "was desperate to keep these pages hidden." Her gaze settled on Claude, who scoffed, his charm a thin veneer. "This is absurd," he said. "I barely knew the boy. Why should I care about some old book?" But Miss Marple, undeterred, produced the button with the eagle crest, holding it up to the lamplight. "This was found in the alley where Pierre died," she said. "It matches your cufflinks, Monsieur Renaud. Curious, don't you think?" Claude's face paled, but he recovered quickly, his voice sharp. "Buttons are common, mademoiselle. You have no proof." Miss Marple smiled faintly, recalling a Danefield case where a single thread had unravelled a theft. "Perhaps," she said, "but the manuscript tells a different story." She pointed to a page where the name Renaud appeared beside coded entries. "Your father, I believe, was implicated in wartime betrayals. Pierre found this, didn't he, and threatened to expose it." Julien shifted, his limp evident as he leaned forward. "Pierre was reckless," he muttered. "He stirred up old wounds." Miss Marple turned to him, her eyes kind but probing. "You knew of the manuscript, Monsieur Moreau, from your resistance days with Pierre. You warned him to stop, didn't you? But you didn't kill him." Julien's shoulders sagged, relief mingling with guilt. "I couldn't stop him," he admitted. "He wanted justice, but I knew the cost." Annette, silent until now, began to weep, her handkerchief pressed to her. Face. I told Pierre to let it go," she sobbed, "but he wouldn't listen." Miss Marple's voice softened, as if comforting a frightened child. "You helped hide the manuscript, didn't you, my dear, to protect someone?" Annetta's eyes flickered to Claude, and the truth spilled out. She had loved Pierre, but feared Claude, who had coerced her into concealing the pages after Pierre showed them to her. "He said he'd ruin my family," she whispered. "My father. He was named in the book, too." Miss Marple nodded, the pieces falling into place. "Monsieur Renaud," she said, turning to Claude, "you argued with Pierre over money, but it was a pretext. You knew he'd found the manuscript, and you followed him to the alley that night. The knife was yours, wasn't it?" Claude's composure cracked, his hands trembling. "You can't prove it," he snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple's eyes were unrelenting. "The button, the manuscript, your offer to buy the bookshop, it all points to you. You killed Pierre to silence him, to protect your family's name." Claude lunged for the door, but the gendarmes, summoned earlier by Miss Marple's discreet note to Elise, were waiting. As they led him away, Annette collapsed into a chair, her sobs filling the room. Julien, his face etched with sorrow, admitted he had suspected Claude but lacked proof, his own wartime shame keeping him silent. Miss Marple patted Elise's hand, her voice soothing. "It's over, my dear. The truth is out and the bookshop is safe." As the room emptied, Miss Marple sat alone, the manuscript pages before her. She thought of Danefield, where a hidden letter had exposed a murderer, and marvelled at how human nature, greed, fear, loyalty, remained the same, whether in a village or a city. The manuscript would go to the authorities, its secrets no longer a threat. She picked up her knitting, the needles clicking softly, her mind already turning to the journey home, where new puzzles no doubt awaited. Chapter 8. The Return to Danefield. The Parisian sky was a tapestry of amber and violet as Miss Jane Marple boarded the train at Gare du Nord, her modest suitcase stowed above, and her knitting bag tucked beside her. The city, with its glittering boulevards and shadowed alleys, receded as the train gathered speed, carrying her back to the quiet lanes of Danefield. She gazed out the window, the Seine's sparkle fading into memory, and reflected on the events that had unfolded at Librairie des Rêves. The resolution of Pierre Lefebvre's murder had been as satisfying as untangling a particularly stubborn knot of wool, yet it left her with a familiar melancholy, a sense that human folly, wherever it was found, followed the same weary patterns. In the bookshop's back room, the truth had emerged with the clarity of a Danefield morning. Claude Renaud, driven by the fear of his family's wartime shame, had killed Pierre to silence him, his polished charm a mask for desperation. Annette's complicity, born of fear for her own father's reputation, had been a sad echo of loyalty misplaced, much like a Danefield girl who'd hidden a cousin's theft. Julien Moreau, burdened by his past but innocent of murder, had reminded Miss Marple of a village carpenter who'd carried guilt for another's crime. The manuscript, Les Ombres de Paris, now safely with the French authorities, would no longer cast its dangerous shadow over Elise's bookshop. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Elise, who had stood bravely through the ordeal, her faith in her old friend unshaken. Over a final cup of tea before Miss Marple's departure, Elise had promised to visit Danefield come spring, her eyes bright with gratitude. "You've saved my shop, Jane," she'd said, her voice warm, "and perhaps my heart." Miss Marple had smiled, deflecting the praise with a gentle wave, but inwardly she felt the quiet satisfaction of a task well done. She recalled a Danefield mystery where a lost brooch had led to a family's reconciliation, and hoped Elise would find peace in the wake of these revelations. The train rattled through the French countryside, fields golden under the autumn sun. Miss Marple opened her knitting bag, her needles resuming their familiar rhythm, a soft click that grounded her thoughts. She considered the manuscript's secrets, names of collaborators, betrayals from a war long ended, and how they had sparked such violence. It was not unlike a Danefield scandal, where a hidden will had driven a man to poison. Greed, shame, fear, the motives were universal, whether in a Parisian alley or an English village. She wondered briefly if the authorities would act on the manuscript's revelations, but that was no longer her concern. Her part was done, the threads tied off neatly. As the train crossed into England, Miss Marple's mind drifted to Danefield, where her cottage awaited, its lace curtains and crackling fire a haven of simplicity. She imagined the village gossip, Mrs. Price at the post office, no doubt, speculating about her Paris adventure, and smiled faintly. There would be questions, curious glances, perhaps a new mystery brewing among the hedgerows. Her neighbours, unaware of her keen mind, would see only the elderly spinster with her knitting, and that suited her perfectly. Anonymity, she knew, was her greatest ally. As it had been in Paris, the station at Danefield came into view, its platform quiet save for a few locals. Miss Marple gathered her things, her umbrella tucked under her arm, and stepped onto the familiar ground. The air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke, a stark contrast to Paris's perfume of chestnuts and river mist. As she walked toward Willow Lane, her steps steady despite the journey's fatigue, she felt a flicker of anticipation. Life, she knew, had a way of presenting new puzzles, and her sharp eyes would be ready. In her cottage, she lit the fire and settled into her armchair, the knitting needles clicking once more. The Paris mystery was solved, but others would come, as they always did. Miss Marple glanced at the window, where the first stars glimmered, and thought of Elise, the bookshop, and the shadowed alleys that had revealed their secrets. With a quiet smile, she turned her attention to her wool, content to wait for the next story life would bring.